The greatest heist in human history didn't happen in a bank vault or a jewelry store. It happened on live television on a Sunday night in 1971 when the President of the United States looked into the camera and told the world that the money in their pocket was no longer money. He stole the future to pay for the past, and we are still paying the price today. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. If you were watching television on the evening of August 15, 1971, your favorite show was interrupted. The face of President Richard Nixon appeared on the screen. He looked serious. He looked determined. But underneath the presidential demeanor, he was a man who was cornered. He was about to do something that no American president had ever dared to do. He was about to declare bankruptcy on behalf of the United States of America. He didn't use the word bankruptcy, of course. He used words like stability and protection. He spoke about speculators and international money markets. But the core of his message was simple and devastating. He announced that the United States would no longer redeem its currency for gold. With that single sentence, he ended the world as we knew it. For thousands of years, money had been something tangible. It was gold. It was silver. It was a promise that you could hold in your hand. After 1971, money became nothing more than a ghost. It became a belief. It became a piece of paper backed by nothing but the word of politicians who had already broken their promise. To understand why this moment was the turning point of the American empire, we have to go back to the year 1944. The Second World War was drawing to a close. The cities of Europe and Asia were smoking ruins. The factories of Germany and Japan were destroyed. The treasuries of Great Britain and France were empty. There was only one country left standing, the United States. America had the factories, America had the food, and most importantly, America had the gold. During the war, almost all the gold in the world had flowed into the United States to pay for weapons and supplies. By the end of the war, the U.S. held 2/3 of the entire world's gold supply. So the leaders of the world gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to decide how the new global economy would work. They had no choice but to accept the American terms. They created a system called Bretton Woods. Under this system, the currencies of the world, like the British pound and the French franc and the German mark, were pegged to the U.S. dollar. And the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. It was a brilliant system. It made the U.S. dollar the world's currency. It was literally as good as gold. If you were a French winemaker exporting wine to America, you accepted dollars because you knew that at any moment you could take those dollars to the U.S. Treasury and trade them for a shiny yellow bar of solid gold. The dollar was just a claim check for gold. This gave the United States an incredible power that the French finance minister later called the exorbitant privilege. Because the U.S. printed the world's reserve currency, it could buy things from other countries just by printing money. If America wanted French wine or German cars or Arabian oil, it just printed green pieces of paper. Other countries had to actually produce goods to get money. America just had to run the printing press. For a while, the system worked. The world needed dollars to rebuild. The American economy was a juggernaut. The trust in the dollar was absolute. But power corrupts, and the power to print money corrupts absolutely. In the 1960s, the United States began to spend money like a drunken sailor. President Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to build a great society. He launched massive welfare programs to end poverty. At the same time, he escalated the war in Vietnam. Guns and butter. That was the phrase. The U.S. wanted to have massive military dominance abroad and massive social spending at home. But wars are expensive. Welfare is expensive. And the U.S. government didn't want to raise taxes to pay for them because raising taxes is unpopular. So they did what empires always do in the quiet decay phase. They cheated. They printed more paper dollars than they had gold in the vaults. They created more claim checks than there was gold to claim. They were betting that the rest of the world wouldn't notice. They were betting that nobody would actually walk up to the window and ask for the metal. It was a classic bank run waiting to happen. But the world did notice. The Europeans were not stupid. They saw the U.S. spending billions on a war in the jungle. They saw the U.S. inflation rate ticking up. They saw the flood of dollars entering their economies, and they started to do the math. There was one man who was particularly suspicious: Charles de Gaulle, the President of France. De Gaulle was a proud nationalist. He resented the fact that America could buy French companies and French land with paper money that was created out of thin air. He looked at the numbers, and he realized the scam. He saw that America had printed far more money than it could ever redeem. So in 1965, de Gaulle did something legendary. He announced that France would no longer accept American IOUs. He wanted the gold. He sent the French Navy across the Atlantic Ocean to New York City. They sailed into the harbor with ships loaded with paper US dollars. They unloaded the paper, and they demanded the gold bars that were promised to them. It was a financial act of war. Other nations saw what France was doing and they panicked. If France took all the gold, there would be nothing left for them. So they joined the run on the bank. Spain started redeeming dollars. Great Britain asked for billions in gold. The gold began to flow out of Fort Knox at a terrifying speed. By 1971, the situation was critical. The United States had $12 billion in gold reserves left. But there were tens of billions of paper dollars circulating around the world. If everyone asked for their gold at once, the United States would be insolvent. The vaults would be empty. The empire would be humiliated. President Nixon was trapped. He faced an election in 1972. He couldn't afford a recession. He couldn't afford to admit that the war in Vietnam had bankrupted the country. So he summoned his advisors to a secret meeting at Camp David. It was Friday, August 13th, 1971, a Friday the 13th. Appropriate for a horror story. The meeting was top secret. The advisors were told to arrive separately. They were cut off from the outside world. The phones were disconnected. Nixon didn't invite serious academic economists. He invited politicians and PR men. He invited men who cared about winning the election, not about the long-term health of the currency. They debated for 3 days. They had 3 options. Option 1 was to stop printing money, to raise interest rates, to cut government spending, to stop the war, to induce a massive recession to restore faith in the dollar. This was the honest option. It was also political suicide. Nixon would lose the election. Option 2 was to devalue the dollar. To say that instead of $35 buying an ounce of gold, maybe it took $70 or $100. This would admit weakness, but it would keep the system alive. Option 3 was the nuclear option. To default, to simply slam the window shut, to tell the world that the promise was broken, to turn the dollar from a gold-backed currency into a fiat currency backed by nothing but faith. Nixon chose option 3. He chose it because it was the easiest path in the short term. It allowed him to keep spending. It allowed him to keep the war going. It allowed him to pump up the economy for the election. But he knew he couldn't go on TV and say, "I am defaulting on the national debt." He had to spin it. He had to make it sound like a patriotic move against evil foreign speculators. And so we get the speech on August 15th. He looked the American people in the eye and he lied. He said he was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold temporarily. Temporarily. That word is the most dangerous word in the vocabulary of government. Income tax was introduced as a temporary measure. The departure from gold was temporary. More than 50 years later, that window is still closed. The reaction was chaos. The international currency markets shut down. The world didn't know how to price anything anymore. If a dollar wasn't worth a specific amount of gold, what was it worth? It was worth whatever the market said it was worth. Nixon sent his Treasury Secretary John Connally to Europe to explain the decision to the angry allies. Connally famously told the European finance ministers, "The dollar is our currency, but it is your problem." It was the ultimate expression of imperial arrogance. America had used its status as the superpower to force the world to swallow its inflation. But the real consequences of 1971 were not felt immediately by the average person. They played out over decades, like a slow-acting poison. When money is anchored to gold, the government is constrained. It cannot spend more than it has. It cannot fight endless wars. It cannot build massive welfare states without raising taxes. Gold is a disciplinarian. It forces politicians to be honest. When Nixon cut the anchor, the ship of state drifted out into the open ocean of fiat money. Without the restraint of gold, the government could print as much money as it wanted. And that is exactly what they did. Look at a chart of the U.S. national debt. From 1776 to 1971, it rises slowly, usually only spiking during wars, and then coming back down. But after 1971, the line goes vertical. It shoots up like a rocket. Look at a chart of inflation. Before 1971, prices were relatively stable. A bottle of Coca-Cola cost 5 cents for 50 years. After 1971, prices exploded. The inflation of the 1970s was not an accident. It was the direct result of the Nixon shock. The price of oil quadrupled. The price of gold went from $35 to $800. The savings of the American middle class were evaporated by inflation. But the most insidious change was in the social structure of America. In a gold standard world, you get rich by saving and producing. You work hard, you save your gold coins, and your purchasing power stays safe. In a fiat money world, savers are losers. If you hold cash, the inflation eats it away. To get rich in a fiat world, you have to borrow. You have to speculate. You have to buy assets like houses and stocks that will rise with the inflation. This shifted the American economy from a nation of producers to a nation of gamblers. It empowered the financial sector. Wall Street exploded in size and power. The bankers who could access the cheap new money first got rich, while the workers whose wages stayed flat got poor. The gap between the rich and the poor in America really started to widen after 1971. Before that, wages and productivity rose together. After 1971, productivity kept going up, but wages flatlined. The wealth generated by the economy was siphoned off by the financial system, which was feasting on the new credit. And what about the empire? How did the US survive this default? Why didn't the dollar collapse completely? This is the second part of the genius of the American system. When the gold backing was removed, the US needed a new reason for the world to hold dollars. They found it in the Middle East. 3 years after the Nixon shock, the US made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The US offered military protection and weapons to the Saudi royal family. In exchange, the Saudis agreed to price all their oil in US dollars. This created the petrodollar system. If any country in the world wanted to buy oil, they had to get dollars first. This created a permanent artificial demand for the US currency. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by oil and by the US military that protected the oil. This allowed the quiet decay to continue for another 50 years. It allowed America to run massive trade deficits. We could buy cheap plastic goods from China and cheap oil from the Middle East and send them pieces of paper in return. We exported inflation and imported real wealth. It seemed like magic, but magic always has a price. The price was the deindustrialization of America. Because the dollar was kept artificially strong to serve as the global reserve currency, American factories became uncompetitive. They closed down. The jobs moved overseas. The heartland of America hollowed out. We traded our factories for cheap credit. We traded our independence for cheap imports. And now, 50 years later, we are reaching the end of the road that Nixon started us on. The debt is now so large that it can never be paid back in real terms. The only way the government can pay its bills is to print more money. We are seeing the return of inflation. We are seeing countries like Russia and China trying to break away from the dollar system, just like France tried to do in the 1960s. They are buying gold again. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record rates. They know the game is ending. The Nixon shock was not just a policy change. It was a moral failure. It was the moment the government decided that it was easier to lie about the value of money than to live within its means. It broke the trust between the citizen and the state. When you work for a dollar, you are trading your time and your life for that currency. You trust that the currency will hold its value so you can use it in the future. When the government debases the currency, they are stealing your time. They are stealing your life. Nixon thought he was solving a temporary problem. He thought he was outsmarting the speculators. But he was actually lighting the fuse on a time bomb that is exploding today. He turned the bedrock of the global economy into quicksand. And we have been sinking ever since. Most people today have no idea that money used to be different. They think it is normal for prices to go up every year. They think it is normal for the government to have $30 trillion in debt. They think it is normal for houses to cost 10 times the average salary. None of this is normal. It is the symptom of a monetary system that has lost its anchor. It is the symptom of a currency that died in 1971 and has been kept alive on life support ever since. When future historians look back at the decline of the American empire, they will not point to a specific battle or a specific election. They will point to August 15, 1971. They will say that was the day the discipline died. That was the day the reality was traded for an illusion. That was the day the golden age ended and the age of paper began. And paper, as Voltaire famously said, eventually returns to its intrinsic value. Zero. The dollar is still the king of currencies for now. But it is a king without a crown. It rules by inertia and by the lack of a better alternative. But the quiet decay is getting louder. The vaults are not empty of gold anymore, but the system is empty of trust. And in the world of finance, trust is the only thing that matters. Once it is gone forever. Nixon promised us that the suspension was temporary. But the destruction of your purchasing power is permanent. The default happened. You just didn't realize it because the dollar bill in your pocket looked the same. But it wasn't the same. It was a ghost. And we have been living in a haunted house ever since.